On today's edition of Locked On LSU, John Garcia Jr., Locked On's official recruiting insider, will join us to take an early look at the 2024 class. Plus, we'll break down some other changes that are happening in the SEC in 2024. All of that, plus so much more, on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thanks for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Plus, you can also find us on YouTube as well. Locked On LSU. Like, comment, and subscribe on our YouTube page. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I'm your host as I am every day. You can follow me on Twitter at CarolineFenton1. Well, joining Locked On LSU now is Locked On's official recruiting insider, John Garcia Jr. John, appreciate you for joining the show, as we always do. But I want to look at LSU's 2024 class. And I know that there is so much time from now until the early signing period coming up next season. So I want to start with this is, how much can things really change? I know we look at like a Tavion Galloway kind of guy who is ride or die for LSU at this point, but how much real estate can we really put into the 2024 class on February 21st?
I think for most programs, Carolina, you wouldn't put almost any stock into it, but LSU's off to a great start, as you know, nearing double-digit verbal commitments in the class of 24, and you've got some key holes filled in this class already. You mentioned Galloway, so you're going out of state, back to Brian Kelly's Midwestern stomping grounds. Of course, he's flanked by a bunch of Louisianans that have already jumped into this class. And most importantly, you've got your quarterback. Colin Hurley is on board and just as gung-ho publicly about LSU as any of these current verbal commitments. So you've got a strong foundation and that quarterback already on board who's going to serve as an extension of the coaching staff, not only in who to target, who to talk to, but even in the implementation, the organization of the group chat or whatever the communication tool is for this LSU commitment list. It's already established with a lot of different personalities. So I do think it's got the opportunity to truly be the foundation of this class. Obviously, a lot of targets out there. As you mentioned, the board will change, but typically you don't expect it to change with local elite talent and or your quarterback, which LSU's already got both elements there on board. So for most classes, wouldn't even sniff at the current commitment list. But for this one, I do think most of these guys will actually stick with LSU, and Hurley in particular will help to build around the rest of these guys for the remaining several months until signing day.
Couple things that you touched on there that I want to get into. One, the quarterback in this class. You mentioned Colin Hurley. And I usually say, by a rule of thumb, you want to get a quality quarterback in every single class. But I look at the rate of quarterbacks transferring, and I mean, it is skyrocketed. There was a study done in The Athletic that from 2017 to 2020, the top 50 quarterbacks in college football at the time, 70% of them have transferred. And you look at all the factors that have increased that. You know, the 2021, you have the year of grace, the first-time transfer. Look at NIL, how that's kind of changed things. So I almost look at it like, well, you still want to collect as much quarterback talent as you possibly can. The rate of these quarterbacks transferring away is at an all-time high. And we've seen it with Walker Howard. So it's almost like trying to balance collecting quarterback talent, but also not wanting that quarterback talent to transfer away. It's a delicate balance there.
100%. It's the most volatile item in college football. And throwing in the COVID year that a lot of kids are still benefiting from an eligibility standpoint. Look at Bo Nix and Michael Penix out in the Pac-12. It just makes things that much harder. But I do still think the foundation is you would prefer the key term here, you'd prefer to build it through not the draft like the NFL, but through recruiting, right? You want to develop and identify these targets at a young age and allow them to blossom. The difference is, as you mentioned, the timeline for the development is all stunted right now. You're either Trevor Lawrence and you're ready to go day one, or you're not. And if you're not, you're usually on the move in 12 to 18 months. And that's really what has stunted a lot of these quarterback rooms and a lot of these quarterbacks from making that kind of traditional development where you sit and develop and eventually get the keys to an offense. I will say with Hurley, he satisfies a lot of I think, modern traits relative to the position. He's big, he's physical, he's mobile, but he wants to stay in the pocket as a quarterback. And he's got a lot of experience. I think he started in 8th grade at Trinity Christian Academy.
Cool.
So even though he moved up a year, he's won multiple state championships. He's got as much experience and throws under his belt as any quarterback in this class of 2024. So I do think he's got some staying power and unique traits about him that could be really advantageous for LSU for years to come. And I think that's part of the reason why he committed so early. Remember last cycle, it took LSU a good while to figure out the quarterback position until Ricky Collins flipped from Purdue. But you went after a lot of different guys before that point, even in the home state. LSU, the state of Louisiana, was loaded at the QB position. We don't see that in 24 and beyond, but it still took a long path towards, landing a quarterback. I think it was late in the summer. So to have one on board in November of last year, so critical for the development of this LSU class. And I think if you look at a lot of the top classes early on in 2024, they've got that in common. A quarterback who bought in early that is helping to galvanize those around him. Not to say that it's going to ensure he stays at LSU for the next 3, 4, however many years, but it feels more likely that a kid like that sticks around because he's invested more than just his own time and energy into this 2024 class there at LSU. You might have a little more inclination to stick around than the typical kid who maybe jumps on board later in the recruiting cycle. So, of course, it'll be fascinating, but I do think he's got a lot of staying power in his game and what he wants to present. Very professional. Reminds me a little bit of Jalen Hurts and how he navigated the recruiting process, jump on board early, build the class, and kind of stick it out thereafter. So it'll be interesting to see with Hurley, but obviously LSU in a really good spot right now, having him on board and building the rest of this class out.
And it's a fair point, kind of creating that nucleus. It was something that even though Walker Howard did end up transferring, ultimately it was a business decision. He did talk about how tough of a decision that was to make because he had so many good friends and had so many foundations at LSU that was something that he really had to think about. But the second thing that I want to touch on was you mentioned kind of that Midwestern Brian Kelly recruiting area. That's something that I touched on with this 2023 class. And if you look at some of the Les Miles recruiting classes, some of the Ed Orgeron recruiting classes, they focused on what I call, the LSU comfort zone. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Florida, the areas that are so rich in talent, but all of the areas that are kind of in LSU's backyard. I look at this 2023 class, and you've got kids from Maryland, Ohio, you've got all across the Midwest, you've got a kid from Vegas coming out of Bishop Gorman. So you really are looking at a more, complete national recruiting class, more so than just that southeastern area. And I think they're both important. So just kind of your perspective of looking at this 23 class and this 24 class that is developing, that already is reaching outside of that quote unquote LSU comfort zone, how important it is to stay Southeastern, but also look around at the country as a whole and how you see that 2024 class developing.
I think it's ironic, right? Because when Brian Kelly took the job, everybody was focused on, can LSU keep recruiting in the same comfort zone that you mentioned? Can they continue to dominate the state? Can they go over to Texas like they always have to and recruit the rest of that SEC footprint down into Florida? But nobody, including yours truly, nobody was talking about the inverse of that. Can Brian Kelly bring a more national appeal to the Bayou? Which, look, at Notre Dame, you've got to recruit nationally. Notre Dame has success in Texas and Florida and California just as much as it does closer to home. So I do think that foundation that he always had to operate within is helping at LSU because now you do it in spots. It's not a necessity, but it's more of a luxury. So when you do zero in on a Tavion Galloway from Ohio or whoever else outside of the LSU footprint, there is that combination of familiarity on top of it. And the kids feel like a priority because they're not in New Orleans or on the Gulf Coast. So I do think it creates more cachet with that LSU scholarship offer. It feels bigger than maybe it did 5 or 10 years ago to those prospects who typically wouldn't have picked up that offer anyway. And if you look back and zoom out traditionally, Midwestern recruits have done a really nice job at LSU. I mean, hello, Joe Burrow. I mean, it doesn't matter the path, right? As long as you get there, I do think that matters more and more. You've got to recruit nationally, and that LSU team in 19 that everybody loves and looks back to, maybe even more so as time goes on. Yes, it was certainly Bayou based and SEC based, but if you zoom out on that recruiting class and that whole makeup of the roster, there was a lot of national influence on that LSU team. And obviously, most of the teams that win national titles do that. They go well outside of the footprint. Look at Georgia. Best player was Brock Bowers from Napa, California. Keely Ringo's a West Coaster on that roster. You've got to recruit nationally, even if you're in such a fertile recruiting area like LSU happens to be in.
So who stands out in the 2024 class? That's what I want to get into with John coming up next. Well, we're at the midway point of the NBA season, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000, now is the perfect time to download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It is safe, secure, and also it is super easy to use. One of my favorite things about the FanDuel Sportsbook app is it doesn't take long to load, and the user interface is really easy to understand. So if you want to look around at different bets on the NBA, you can do that, and you can bet on everything from the money line to the point scorers to threes drained. There's so many exclusive bets and promotions. Like there's the 2x3. So there's 2 3-pointers scored in the first 3 minutes. If you think that's going to happen on a certain game in the NBA, you can wager on that and so much more with FanDuel. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So where it stands in the 2024 class, and there is so much that is going to change from now until the 2024 season. But right now, LSU sits with the 3rd overall recruiting class for the 2024 class. We're looking really far ahead here. But John, as far as this class is constructed, who really stands out to you so far?
I mean, obviously Hurley is a guy who has that it factor. He's a galvanizing force. You see it on Friday nights. You also see it during the offseason, during kind of 7-on-7 tournament camp era stuff. You see Colin with a lot of folks around him. And not only is he recruiting for LSU, again, reminds me of Jalen Hurts and how he carries himself, very aware of the perception around him and trying to be steady within that or beyond that, depending on the specific inference. So I do like Hurley's demeanor and maturity, but his game is really good too. I think that's where we lose some of it. I mean, his game, he is a galvanizing quarterback on the field, a guy who could be the focal point of an offense, can certainly keep a defense honest with his mobility and his rushing ability, but his arm, when he steps into a throw at 215 pounds, Caroline, you can hear it sometimes. I was told a couple weeks ago at a 7-on, a couple receivers in warmups were catching balls from Colin and then kind of like shaking their hands out like, dang, that thing came in kind of hot. So arm strength is a big strength for Colin Hurley. So obviously I like that. I got an opportunity to see Joseph Stone recently in person, and you'd have fooled me by his listed size, 5'11", 175 or so. Looks bigger, plays bigger, unbelievable acceleration and explosiveness, but his bounce, his catch radius allows him to play like a true wide receiver 1, even though he's not built like that. So big fan of his as well. We mentioned Galloway as his personality. I love his modern traits. I think he could block, he could split out, all the same, very much kind of a Notre Dame type of tight end. And that's not a knock to the LSU tight ends of the past, but Notre Dame's one of those tight end U type of programs that Brian Kelly furthered during his tenure there. And I think Galloway has a lot of those traits in his bag as well. So we know defensive recruiting is going to pick up, and there's already some nice back 7 pieces in this class, Zion Ferguson included there. But I really like the offensive start in particular for LSU. It's diverse. You've got your quarterback on board. You're going outside of that Louisiana footprint. So now you can kind of center it in and bring it close to home and round out the class really successfully on offense.
And I think that's why Tavion Galloway is so interesting. Beyond his personality and how outspoken he's been on social media, he's doing recruiting of his own on Twitter. Oh, yeah. But I think he is interesting to me because Mike Denbrock and Brian Kelly's history of usage of the tight end position is so interesting. It's so different than what we're used to seeing with LSU. With LSU historically, it's that vintage style of offense of run the football, rely on those wide receivers. very few tight ends really stick out to me in the history of LSU football, and that is changing. We saw it immediately with Mason Taylor. There were so many times I was getting frustrated. I'm like, will you quit throwing the ball to the freshman tight end and throw it to Kayshon Boutte? But really, it paid off in the long run with Mason Taylor and how he was utilized and how they will continue to utilize and develop not just Mason Taylor, but also these guys in the 2023 and 2024 classes as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you've got to use tight ends as much as you can nowadays. Not only do they serve as an extension of the offensive line, but like you said, they've become the biggest mismatch in the game of football, in the passing game, because they're just too big for DBs, and oftentimes they're too swift for linebackers that want to try to check them at the line of scrimmage. And Mason Taylor's a great example. And he wasn't even, no disrespect to Mason, big fan of him and Dad. I'm a Miami guy, right? But look, Mason wasn't the most coveted tight end in the country coming out of high school, and look at how quickly he hit the ground running with a high floor. So imagine if you start to compare and add on to those with guys with higher ceilings, longer, more kind of traditional pass first tight ends, along with the balanced Mason Taylor types. Now, all of a sudden, you're bringing that tight end U mentality to the Bayou. And those are all comforts for quarterbacks, right? They're helping you in the running game. They're helping you from the protection standpoint. And obviously, they're on the other end of some of your passes there along the way. So that's another element that we probably didn't focus on enough when Brian Kelly made this move down to LSU. We were so concerned about the negative that there was a whole lot of positive he was bringing as well.
Yeah, I'm guilty of it, to be completely fair. But we focus on 2024 with LSU, but there's some massive changes happening in 2024 to the SEC, to college football. So how does that affect recruiting? We'll get into that with John coming up next. So Texas and Oklahoma officially joining the SEC in 2024, and that has, so many effects of scheduling, of rivalries, how all of that is going to be changing, whether it's a 1-6 or a 3-6 model in terms of scheduling in the SEC. But I think one thing that goes unnoticed is how that move could potentially disrupt or change recruiting in the SEC. What's your perspective on that? Do you think it really could be a major shakeup in terms of recruiting with Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC?
Absolutely. Not only are those two their own brands, they've also kind of dominated the SEC footprint. I think once A&M and Mizzou got added, I don't remember which year that was, a long time ago.
2012.
That was the gateway to everyone else going west and recruiting the state of Texas. And that became a real contrarian issue for both Texas and Oklahoma that rely on the Lone Star State for the bulk of their roster. So it forced them to go a little bit further outside the box. But now that they're going to be in the SEC, they can utilize both ends of it, much like we just talked about with Brian Kelly at LSU. They'll use the traditional and certainly continue to use Texas as its foundation. But now they're going to use some of those external elements even further. Look at Texas last year. Obviously, Arch Manning heads out there. Derek Williams, one of the best safeties in the country from Louisiana, ends up at Texas as well. I think that is something to keep an eye on from an LSU perspective. We've seen different programs pick and prod in the state. Obviously, Alabama is the most notable, A&M probably second, but now we're starting to see Notre Dame come down, Ohio State's coming down, and now with Texas and Oklahoma jumping over, I think you see a little bit more of a consistent presence from those two programs down in the Gulf Coast altogether. And then it also overlaps with LSU beyond their traditional footprint. You go into South Florida, you go into even California, Arizona, some places where Texas and Oklahoma have long recruited. We've seen SEC teams, traditional SEC teams, try to spot recruit out there as well. I think that angle becomes a little bit tougher with the SEC flag on the Texas and OU branding. So it really brings two powers from a recruiting standpoint into the power conference from recruiting. So it's going to be fascinating. I wonder who's going to expand their pipeline a little bit more, or can Texas and OU start to pull back the state of Texas like they did in the 90s and early 2000s when the recruiting, this era of recruiting began, and you couldn't go into Texas and grab a kid because he was either going to Texas or OU. Maybe A&M was a distant third. That has all shifted in the last decade. Can Texas and OU reclaim some of that now that they're in the SEC? That will be among the fascinating standpoints to look into. But there's no doubt that it's as wide open as it's ever been, and folks are going to try to go into enemy territory even more than they already have in recent memory.
And I think you look at the Big 12 and the SEC and any conference in college football, you see different styles. You see each conference kind of has their own personality in terms of style of play. Have you seen a shift in recruiting in both Texas and Oklahoma as they join the SEC? Maybe some football philosophies start to change to kind of fit the SEC a little bit more. Have you seen those two schools start to recruit a little bit differently to accommodate a potential change in style of play?
Well, both of those programs brought in head coaches that understand kind of that championship mentality from a recruiting standpoint. Both Steve Sarkisian and Brent Venables, they're trying to build that thing from the inside out, from the trenches on out. I mean, Texas has signed like 13 offensive linemen in the last two classes. Oklahoma's doing the same on the defensive line. So, yeah, I do think you see more of an added emphasis. It's not as much about the skill positions and the flashy spots as much as it is about the big boys, about the line of scrimmage. So I do think that is very much more in the SEC footprint compared to that traditional perception around the Big 12. So we've already seen that shift. And I think that's part of the reason why those two coaches in particular hold those two head coaching spots, because they understand the importance of recruiting from the inside out. And they've, at least in efforting, they've gone and pushed in that direction. Texas more successfully than Oklahoma recently, but obviously Brent Venables is a year behind Sarkisian in his tenure there. So in the 24 class, I think we'll get a much better sample, because now you're selling kids on playing in the SEC from the beginning of their career. That doubt and uncertainty around that move of Texas and OU to the SEC, all of that is done. We have the definitive timeline of when this thing will go down. So now you're telling these juniors in high school, hey, you're playing in the SEC from day one, and you're rocking this Longhorn or this Oklahoma Sooner logo in the process. So I do think it changes things, but it will certainly push more in line with the programs that already run SEC recruiting that always build from the inside out, whether you go Georgia, Bama, certainly LSU in that conversation going forward.
Big changes, absolutely. I'm not ready for it, but it's coming. It's coming nonetheless. John Garcia Jr., we appreciate you for joining the show. Where can the people find you?
Yeah, let's talk ball at every level on Twitter, John Garcia_JR. And of course, right here on the Locked On Network, we're talking ball almost every day. So come join us.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll chat with you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks again for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. So make sure you check out our brand new podcast, Locked On College Basketball. It's got everything that you need to know about college basketball all in one place, wrapped up in a nice, shiny little ribbon. Plus, you're going to hear from big-name experts, insiders, coaches, and players. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for making Locked On LSU your first listen today. So for your second listen, check out our brand new podcast, Locked On College Basketball. Experts Isaac Shade and Andy Patton bring you everything that you need to know on and off the court. Plus, you can hear from big-name experts, coaches, and players throughout the college basketball landscape. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.